So good morning, everybody. My name is Giles Bailey. Say good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. But again, my name is Giles Bailey, and I'm head of policy and partnerships at Vianova. We're a micromobility management company based in France, but working across Europe. And as part of our industry engagement and thought leadership work, we're running a series of webinars over the last few weeks looking at topical mobility issues. We've been witnessing changes in mobility brought about by new business models, innovation, micromobility, as well as challenges to classic public transport modes. And all of this is amongst the context of the unprecedented turmoil in cities around the world brought about by the COVID crises. I mean, a few of the headlines we're facing, what is the future of micromobility electric scooters? Many of the existing operators are scaling back, coming out of various cities due to the ongoing crises. That said, some of the operators are looking at innovative new business models to help key workers for deliveries, food deliveries, and we're even seeing consolidation in the market via activities such as Uber and Jump and Line coming together in the last few days. But there's the wider context of public transport as well. The whole COVID crisis is fundamentally challenging many of the assumptions about classic public transport. How does that classic mode work in the era of social isolation, self-isolation, social distancing? How do we find a new normal? How do we deal with issues of hygiene and again, spacing? And we're seeing reports, insights from learned groups, think tanks all around the world, including the International Transport Forum. And we're seeing activities from cities around reclaiming much more space for walking and cycling and trying to green in a very quick way some of the elements of the transport network to deal with this ongoing crisis. So today we have two guests who will talk about some of the things going on opposite sides of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, from Switzerland and from Austin in Texas in the USA. And what we'll do is we'll have each speaker do a few minutes just talking about their context of their own business. I'll probably ask one or two questions to that speaker and then we'll go on to the second one. And at the end, we'll have time for talking across all of the panelists, but very much we have time for your questions and your thoughts. So what I'd ask you to do is go into the Q&A section on Zoom, type in your comments, type in your questions as you go through, and I'll bring those into the discussion as we progress. But without further ado, as they say, we're going to go straight into Lucas Bühler. He's Director of Growth at Bond Mobility in Zurich, Switzerland, and he's been doing that over the last year. Previously, he was the founder and director of his own startup on sustainable gastronomy and food waste reduction, which he did for 6 years. He's also worked and studied in climate change and sustainability in Switzerland, as well as in North Carolina in the USA. Over to you, Lucas.
So thank you very much, Hugh, for this really lovely introduction, and hi everyone. I'm talking to you from Zurich in Switzerland, and as you might know, in Switzerland we were really affected by the corona crisis, but now the government is actually starting to lift the lockdown, and people are really want to see this lockdown go away, and they're screaming for can we go back to normal? But back to normal is like you can see in the picture. This is our biggest bridge in Zurich, and it's always clogged with traffic. So I'm asking, do we really want to go back to normal? Because it doesn't matter if we have autonomous vehicles. It doesn't matter if we have electrified cars, or it doesn't matter if we decarbonize the car sector. The picture remains the same. The city is flooded with cars. Next slide, please. Therefore, I'm asking, how can we establish a new normal? How can we establish a new transport sector? And now Sheil needs to move to the next slide, I think. Yeah, thanks. So how can we establish a new normal? A new normal where transportation is really smart, healthy, and fun. because just a recent study from the Netherlands showed that only 55% of the car commuters actually are missing their their daily commute with the car, and 90% of the commuters by bike, they really miss their commute with the bike. So this Corona crisis actually shows us that a different world should be possible, and we should not wait and start implementing this today. Why is it so important that we hurry to start creating the new normal? This graph here from ETH Zurich shows you the transportation behavior during March 2020. And as you can see, mid of March, we went into a lockdown. And what you can observe is that the public transport kilometers traveled in Zurich plunged for around 80%. Also, car usage went back. But actually, people were using their bikes and e-bikes. So what does this graph show us? Actually, it shows that e-bikes and bikes really can replace cars. E-bikes is a good measure to provide a sustainable solution for our city and transportation. If we really want to, so if we proceed to the future and we see that these social distancing measures are maybe in place for another 6 months, then we need to think, hey, who should we allow to transport the people? Because people won't go back to the public transport. People will start using again their car. And this is my own drawing on the right side. So I draw some possible outcomes for the future. And I'm asking city officials from Zurich and cities all around the world, and I'm keen to hear what Sam is going to say. Should we allow as a society to let cars use this entire space? Or should we establish this new normal and embrace micromobility providers? Because micromobility providers are part of the solution of the future transport system. This is where bond mobility comes into play. At bond mobility, we're replacing cars day by day, ride by ride. And now, Gilles, the next slide, please. Bond mobility can definitely be considered as an essential business at the moment. With our fleet of over 2,000 high-performance e-bikes, we're operating in 5 different markets. In Switzerland, in Zurich, Bern, and Zug. In Germany, in Munich, and in Helsinki. We have a lot of B2B clients, such as Google, Siemens, Denso, and Amag, but our main focus at the moment are B2B clients. Also, I want to mention that in this Corona crisis, we offered our services to many hospital workers. Next slide, please. For creating urban freedom, we know that we have the perfect free-floating sharing system in place. We don't need any rebalancing efforts because we have set smart customer incentives. With our e-bike sharing system, users actually can go from A to B and not from A to C where the station is. So compared to a station-based sharing system, we can really provide the full trip with our own e-bikes. Also, compared to kick scooters, our e-bikes can replace whole trips, commuter trips. Because as we also seen during this Corona crisis, kick scooters have vanished from the streets. Why? Because they are mainly used in combination together with public transport. But not so our high-performance e-bikes. High performance actually means we have speed up to 45 kilometers, and we're really able to replace the cars. So we see our offer as a perfect tool for cities who want to get rid of cars. we collaborate with different kind of public transport providers on multimodal offerings. We provide a healthy and a corona-free transportation. We help the city to fight the coronavirus and the car owner virus. Furthermore, we are user-centered, and the last slide is, we really want to focus on providing smiles and not only miles to the citizens of Zurich, Bern, Munich, Helsinki, and hopefully a lot of more cities to come. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your question.
Thank you very much, Lucas. And before we get to Sam, one question I just wanted to ask you is,
Sure.
Clearly you're using quite powerful and high-performance e-bikes. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you feel the difference in demand that your service is offering versus classic pedal cycles and almost classic and more inexpensive e-bikes and scooters, particularly versus kind of those longer trips that may have been previously been using public transport until the crisis? A little bit more about how you position the types of trips that your service offers.
So a lot of our trips are actually made by commuters, and then we have so around half of the trips are by commuters, and then we also have this, we call it the opportunistic customer, which makes a trip by own bike from A to B, then takes a tram from B to C, and then from C he takes a bond bike again back to B, where actually his bike is locked. So we have different kind of customer segments, and really important, as I said in the beginning, replacing cars. Actually what we see is the main benefit of all the different customer segments.
Excellent. And again, we have some questions coming in. I'm going to take those questions. Probably we get into more general discussion, but please keep your questions and comments in. But again, I wanted to very much get to our second speaker and bring him into the debate as well. So now to Sam Sargent. He's from Capital Metro in Austin, Texas. And when we were looking for an innovative US city to participate in our webinar today, I asked organizations like the American Public Transport Association, Mass Transit Magazine, and Metro Magazine in the US about which city we should be speaking to. And universally, they all said Austin was the city to have on board today. So Sam has worked with Capital Metro for the last 5 years, and he spent 2 years as the Deputy Chief of Staff. He's previously had a background in Texas, in legal areas in Texas and Boston, Massachusetts. And he also has a background in local political support. Over to you, Sam. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Giles. And thank you, Lucas. That was an excellent presentation. That's very exciting. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing, because I think at the end of the day, I'll get to, it really just comes down to geometry and how can we make a more efficient, cleaner world. And public transportation, which is my area, micromobility, which is going to be the area of Lucas and many others on this webinar, is really just critical. They are partners in this. So I will get underway. Giles, first slide.
Oops, sorry. There you go.
So Capital Metro at a glance, just so people know, for those of you who have not had a chance to come to Austin or to have gone to South by Southwest, Austin is about 260 kilometers from Houston, about 315 from Dallas. We have about 2 million people, and that's in the next slide, Giles. We have about 2 million people in our broader region, but in Capital Metro's service area, we have about 1.1 million residents. I think that's probably approximately the same size, Lucas, as the general area of Zurich in terms of people, probably not density, but we have 7 cities, but by and large, most of the funding, most of the people who ride Capital Metro come from Austin. We have about a $400 million budget, which is funded through sales tax. I know that there was one question earlier that I think that we'll get to about budget and about funding, and that's going to vary pretty wildly between countries, between states, between transit agencies, but ours comes directly from sales tax by and large. We have about 31 million annual trips. That's about 110,000 trips per day and growing until this crisis began, of course. About 360 buses, and then we have one rail line with these beautiful, you can see up the photo up there, Metro Rail. They're beautiful Swiss-made Stadler vehicles. We have 10 of them that we're very proud of, and about 2,200 bus stops. Next slide. And while I know that the news over the past, depending on where you are, of course, for us, it's been about 7 weeks since we went into our shelter-in-place lockdown mode, but let's call it, honestly, the balance of 2020. We've had a lot of successes. So I want to put in a little bit of good news here that I know that we could all sorely use, but from Capital Metro's standpoint, we had undergone a redesign of our bus network to make sure that it was more efficient and that we were making better use of our assets and we're connecting our bus and rail system better to our own vehicles, but also to a lot of the micro-transit and micro-mobility options that were out there. So we had 17 straight months of ridership growth. Kids under 18 all ride free, which has been very successful. We've got a very large population of young folks, not just at the university level. And I'll get into our on-demand pickup service, which is our first experiment with microtransit that has been quite successful so far, as well as the electrification of the fleet, which is another critical part of how you sell transit. You have the efficiency of space, you have the affordability element for the customer, but then also the sustainability element that I know that we all care about. Next slide, please. And so the COVID response, next slide, is agency and industry impact. So, of course, this has hit transit, as all of us know, very hard. This is a public health emergency. This is an economic emergency. And in transit was not spared any part of that. Our ridership is down about 65%. It's not as high as we've seen in some other colleagues of ours, like BART in the San Francisco area, down 90%. Our revenues at last measure were down about 6.6%, but we expect the sales tax in April to be down far more than that. Unemployment and teleworking. This is huge. And this is critical whether or not you're a micro-mobility provider, a micro-transit provider, work for a transit agency, you name it, is the absence of a commute is the largest change of all in all of this. And as a transit professional, the absence of a commute is one of the more startling parts of whatever the new normal becomes. And of course, many jobs don't allow for teleworking, whether that's policy or it's that you work in a hotel or at a restaurant. You simply can't do that work remotely. But unemployment hovering around 15, maybe even 20% in the United States is very significant. In Austin, again, for any of you who have visited Austin, live music capital of the world, as we call ourselves, we have a very large service industry. So the hit has been very, very hard here. We've had a 50% decrease in vehicle trips. From what I've heard from the Austin Transportation Department, the decline in a lot of the micro-mobility options, especially dockless scooters, has been similar. Many of our providers have left town. We actually had one of the highest numbers per capita of dockless scooters in the United States up until this, and they had been fully deployed for South by Southwest. I will say that the dockless bikes, especially electric bikes, have seen quite a nice little resurgence. As Lucas mentioned about Zurich, I mean, there are a lot of people out there, probably because the space has opened up in the absence of cars, but there are a lot more people cycling and using micromobility. And then there's public health concerns, pandemic-related fears, and the immediate need for transit providers, as well as any other business that has to accommodate people in tight spaces, whether it's a restaurant or a theater or an airline. There's a lot of education to do, and we have a lot of fear to overcome. And the graph below, you can see that's how our ridership has declined since this really began in earnest in Austin. So we've really leveled off. We're still moving about 40,000 trips per day. Most of those, we assume, are essential trips. A lot of people who work in the healthcare and grocery industries. Next slide, please. And so how are we addressing the public health concerns? How are we addressing the declines in ridership and revenue? So we have reduced much of our commuter, that is suburban service, this longer haul trips. We are operating fare free right now. That's not so much to promote ridership by any means, but it's to ensure that we don't have people approaching our drivers, approaching our operators. We've supplied them with ample masks, gloves, hand sanitizer. We're doing deep cleans midday and overnight. Everything that we can do to keep our customers, our staff, and the public at large safe. And then we're also doing a lot out there in the community, and this is because we have some amount of bandwidth and because it's the right thing to do. We're doing a lot of grocery deliveries, and part of that is because we have an immediate need in Austin of people who cannot go and brave a grocery store or have a weakened immune system, but it's also something that I know a lot of other microtransit operators in the private sector are beginning to experiment with during the crisis. Columbus, Ohio, for example, beginning to use those same vehicles to do small amounts of deliveries. Ridership being down, but not gone. But a lot of the places that we go still have a big need right now for freight. So we're experimenting a bit with what can we do to expand that in the future. Next slide, please. And then looking at the long term, how do we recover from this, both from a financial, from a service standpoint, and from a reputation standpoint? Is that we had hit a point nationally in the United States, I would say, where we were really getting onto a roll with the resurgence of urban life, and especially among older people retiring to cities and young people wanting to move back into downtowns, and transit ridership increasing in the Seattle area, the Bay Area, in Austin. And then all of a sudden this happens, and it's a collective trauma. And how do we move forward through this, and how do we, as a transit agency, but also as a micro mobility or a micro transit provider, how do you get people to get comfortable getting back out and relearning and re-experiencing and re-engaging with their cities? And so that's what we're taking an in-depth review on right now. As I mentioned, we're planning on continuing some of these delivery services, as well as some of our community health efforts. And Project Connect, I say this real quick because Project Connect is something we've been building towards in Austin for 5 years. And this would be a major referendum in November of this year, a multi-billion-dollar effort to invest in light rail, bus rapid transit, and micromobility. Austin is the 11th largest, nearly the 10th largest city in the United States, and outside of San Antonio, which is just ahead of us, is the only city in the United States other than San Antonio to not have a major investment in high capacity transit infrastructure. So rail, dedicated busways, things like that. Our growth rate is pretty staggering. We've doubled in size every 25 years since World War II. We are now looking at doubling in 17 years. Going from 2 million in the region to 4 million, and we're not going to be able to expand our road network quickly enough or ever to accommodate that number of people. And I know that we need to talk through how do we get people comfortable with being in confined spaces again, once we have a better sense of how many people are not working or are working remotely. But at the end of the day, no different than Lucas with Bond, no different than micromobility and microtransit options, it is a game of geometry. And for some people, it's moving people efficiently in smaller, let's call it packets, like on a train or a bus through major corridors, and then dispersing them using things like scooters and e-bikes and things of that nature. So we need to look at what mobility looks like in a post-COVID world. Next slide, please. Next slide. And as I mentioned, our growth rate is pretty astonishing. I think this is probably something that many places are encountering, whether it's because of in-migration or natural growth. Next slide, Giles. And then people have seen this. You can advance quickly through these, Giles. We've got the efficiency of movement. whether or not you're moving people on a bus or a bike, which is also very efficient, or an automobile. At the end of the day, most of us, I would assume, since you're interested in this, live in urban environments, and they simply are not growing in space, but they are growing in people. So whether it's AV or it's electric or it's Uber or Lyft, we have to find these efficiencies of space one way or another. And one way that transit helps is that by pulling more people than you could through a vehicle, you're freeing up more of the urban environment for things like micromobility, if that makes sense for that trip. Next slide, please. I believe this will be my last slide, but just a little quick snapshot of micromobility in Austin. As I said, we've had flattened demand for mobility across the board, and including dockless, which I know has a different business model, and there was probably more to their disappearance than just COVID. And we've seen some reduction in the availability or demand for things like Uber and Lyft. Microtransit, you can see this vehicle here. We have a couple of different vehicles, but these are on-demand 5 square mile zones. It's a service called Pickup that we've had up and running since mid-2018. And this is where we can fill in the gaps in areas where it simply doesn't make sense to put a 35 or a 40-foot bus down in a neighborhood. So how do you draw people to places like grocery stores, to senior centers, to school, or to bus stops, to dockless scooter hubs, to our e-bike and bike share service, which is B-Cycle? How do you find affordable, equitable, and flexible ways to move people more efficiently? And we've had a fantastic response to this. We usually move about 700 folks a day between the 5 zones, but just keep in mind that these are very low density areas. These are oftentimes folks who need this type of service the most, who might otherwise be on a paratransit service. And we're expanding. We have one more zone on the way this year, and we plan on expanding greatly as part of the Project Connect effort. And then there's still a lot of opportunities to partner with the private sector, whether that be autonomous vehicles. We had a quick pilot in 2018 with Easy Mile to do an autonomous vehicle pilot in a controlled environment. E-cabs, B-Cycle, like I said, e-bikes, you name it. At the end of the day, all of these things come together. They're part of a larger network, and the shared goal of all of the shared mobility is to get people out of single occupancy vehicles. I'm not saying you're ever going to eliminate single occupancy vehicles, and I don't think that that's the right answer anyways. I have a 1-car household, and it makes sense for so many trips. It provides freedom. It provides opportunity for people who might have jobs where using an e-bike or using transit simply doesn't make sense, but they're all part of a puzzle. And we're a growing world and a growing urban world. And how do we free up enough space to give our cities back to people who are on foot, and to clean our air, and to make moving that much more affordable and easy for people? So I know that there's a lot of challenges for transit. I'm looking forward to the Q&A and the discussion here, but I think that we're turning a corner and we're learning a lot as we go. Next slide, Giles. And I think that that may be it for my deck, and you can see my contact information down there. But before you send anything there, I'd be happy to move along, Giles, to our Q&A in the chat.
Thank you very much, Sam. Excellent. Yeah. So again, to the audience, we still have about 15 minutes, so keep your questions coming into Q&A, and I'll pose them to both of the speakers. But first, Sam, if you could tell us perhaps a little bit more about the evolution of the micromobility market in Austin. And again, you said you had quite a few operators operating for a period of time, obviously going through the COVID crisis, but perhaps also link that to, as a transit operator and as a city, perhaps where do you now perhaps see the city's role in supporting or encouraging micromobility?
Yeah, so Austin saw an absolute explosion of micromobility operators between dockless scooters of a wide variety of types. Some of them looked more like a tricycle, as well as we've had a bike share program here for some time. It's now expanding into the e-bike, an e-bike fleet, which is fantastic. And we had jump bikes and a lot of other providers. I would say that we were moving towards a dozen providers shortly before this happened. with really, there was regulation, but there was not a limit like we've seen in some cities. So the proliferation of these scooters was huge. And we're a city that is young. We're a city with a lot of startups, with a lot of events, with a lot of conventions. And so the demand was just enormous. And it was pleasure trips. It was trips for work. We've got a downtown that's been exploding over the past decade. So people are making those trips where micromobility really does make a lot of sense. I believe that the averages from the Austin Transportation Department were something in the range of maybe 2 to 2.5 miles on average for a shared bicycle program, but about 3/4 of a mile for a scooter. And to be perfectly honest, when they came into existence here in Austin, people would ask, well, this must have had a huge impact on transit. I've seen so many of the scooters, and the answer was honestly not. I think it's complementary. Because those are way shorter trips, at least in Austin. Maybe it's a little bit different in Boston, for instance, where I lived, or in New York, but that's a way shorter trip than most people would take on transit. So we saw it as a fantastic first mile, last mile connection. It freed up the amount of road space that was being used for short car trips, but especially parking in the central business district, which is where transit everywhere that's not in a dedicated lane or in a tunnel or on rail gets jammed up. So we saw it as a way to decongest our downtown. And I think because of a tightening of venture capital funding, I think because of the COVID crisis, we've seen a huge contraction in the number of providers. But to your point about where does government come into this, I do think that this is going to increase calls to have more government subsidies or promotion, or however it winds up working out, for first mile, last mile micro mobility, micro transit. The city of Austin has been an underwriter of our B-Cycle program for some time, and whether or not they expand into the scooter world remains to be seen, but we see it as a partnership. We make space wherever we can on the curb to accommodate dockless scooters, so that when you get off the bus after a 10 or 15 mile trip, because it is Texas, where the distances for a lot of our commuters are quite large, that they have that last mile connection. So there's going to be a lot of synergies there, and there's going to need to be a lot of experimentation. But long story short, I see them as being complementary. We both have a lot of challenges in the COVID world, but we can both help each other quite a bit.
Again, thank you, Sam. We have lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to go back to Lucas, though, on an earlier one, and perhaps link it to what Sam has just said, particularly on the length of trip that all mobility vehicles are being used, and maybe a little bit pre and post the crisis around COVID. Lucas, can you tell us a little bit more about what you've experienced, or what you even expected in Switzerland as a result of that?
So our average trip is around 4.5 kilometers, I think roughly 3 miles. And actually during the crisis, the trip length has increased. This also indicating that we're replacing actually cars, because I've seen also one question how this is measured. And so we are looking forward to collaborations with the local public transport, for example, for people moving in from not so dense areas with public transport. And then we have stations where they can switch from the public transport to micromobility providers. So actually that we have, say, local changing points where we can interchange and make like a multimodal trip. So actually I think in combination, this is really the key word here, so that we can provide a really good solution for all different kind of opportunities to the citizens. And
thank you.
Yeah, maybe one thing I also seen in the question of so are we free floating or not? Maybe I did not correctly state this, but yes, it's a free floating bike share system, and actually we're incentivizing the users to bring the bike to a charging station. So actually, whenever the battery is low, you on the app you see that you can see the closest charging station, and you get a free credit for your next ride if you connect the bike to the charging station. So actually, we as Bond Mobility, we save on costs, and you as a user, you actually earn money while riding bikes. So that's a pretty cool, smart feature. We're really proud of it.
Thank you, Lucas. Again, lots of questions coming in, but I'm going to go back to Sam with a question for both of you in a sense. Car usage, and obviously looking at Texas more generally in the Southwest US, but what, as transit professionals, people in the public transport micromobility industry, are we saying to people who say, I need to drive a car now because that's the only hygienic way or self-isolation way of getting around? How do we counter that argument? And again, it'd be interesting from the Texas point of view to start with, but also Lucas as well.
Sure. Yeah, it is an interesting profession to be in Texas and in the Southwest. People love their cars, and so much of the urban environment was built post-war, was built for the car, around the car, and a lot of it makes sense. The distances are just enormous, and it was not part of the culture, and for the longest time, the growth was not dense either. And density is the best assurance of a good functioning transit system. So when you don't have that, the investment's not going to follow. But it's always been a challenge. We have increased our ridership, as I mentioned, 17 straight months. It's fantastic. But the mode share for transit in Austin is about 2%, 3%. You go to a New York City, and I believe 25% of the trips into Manhattan are in a single occupancy vehicle. In Austin, it's probably closer to 95%. The city and Capital Metro, though, have been committed as part of a ongoing strategic plan to getting the mode split down to 50-50 between automobiles and anything but an automobile. So transit has a component in there that might be 15%, but active mobility, micro-transit, micro-mobility are going to need to be a huge part of that. And then teleworking as well. We've always known that teleworking was going to increase, but our hope is that it increases while decreasing single occupancy vehicle trips, no different than somebody using an e-bike or using transit. But in terms of making people feel comfortable, to making our existing customers feel comfortable getting back onto our service, we have to try a lot of different things. It is sanitation, and it's hygiene and everything else. And then it's also just how do you create the perception of safety to make people feel that much more comfortable. Right now, we're seating people every other seat. We're putting our operators behind a plexiglass door. We're going back to essentially a full regular schedule, because even though we're 65% down on ridership, that should space people out more. So it's going to take a while, but when people come back specifically about transit and say, how are you ever going to get people back onto the service? I'd have to counter that if you really don't think that that's possible, you're taking a pretty dim view on people living together as people. I mean, restaurants and theaters and cities or even towns or churches, you name it, at some point we're all going to have to trust that the safety measures are going to keep us healthy and then still move forward. And again, it's been a shared trauma. And so there's a lot of fear out there. But also all of the arguments will begin for transit will begin coming back as streets get more congested again. Parking is not going to get any cheaper in downtown Austin or any other major central city. And people in areas that have seen a great reduction in greenhouse gases as people have stayed home will probably start to see the skies turn brown again, and we'll wonder, I don't know, we should probably go back to doing what we were doing before. So I think all the benefits of transit have not gone out the door, but I do know that it's going to be a slow transition to getting people feeling comfortable just being around a lot of people again. So it's a heavy lift, but it's a part of a broader culture change. And I think we'll get there. There's a lot of strong arguments for transit and for micromobility and for anything other than a single occupancy vehicle.
Thank you very much, Sam. Actually, before I pass to Lucas, there's one aspect I'd like to bring into both of you, and that's on data. And probably there isn't time to get into the complexities of standards and so on, but data and the role of cities and operators. Perhaps, Lucas, to start with, could you just provide a little bit of a comment on your thinking of that? and then we'll come back to Sam. And you can add about cars as well. But over to you, Lucas.
Definitely. So actually, we're collaborating, or we're starting to collaborate with the city of Zurich, together with you, with Vianova. And actually, it's a smart city project where the city of Zurich wants to know more about where the vehicles are standing, which trips are made, and so forth. Our special case is that we have really high precision data on where the streets are actually used by bikes. So our bikes have an internal GPS system collecting all the routes which have been taken. And this data is very valuable for the city because they can plan the streets accordingly. So far, they only have around 7 or 8 measurement points where they can count when a bike is crossing. So compared to that, we have thousands of trips per day, and we can help them really to make the infrastructure ready for the future, to make the infrastructure safe for fast e-bikes. And the one point is that we are not yet collaborating is because we know that this data is very valuable, and so far we're in discussion of how we should transfer this data to the city of Zurich, because at the same time that we are providing an essential service to the cities of Zurich, actually the city of Zurich is actually charging us, and they're charging us $10 per month per bike. And this doesn't sound too much, but actually, if you have, we call it the Blaue Zone Parkkarte, which allows you to park your car in the city, and this only costs 160 Swiss francs, or around $150 per year. So for around 1/5 of the space we're using with the bikes, we're actually paying the equal amount then to a car. So I refer to the car parking system here in Zurich as the biggest subsidized free floating system in Zurich. So so we have to kind of find a good path forward with the city that we're actually happy to help them reducing, let's say, in the night where the people don't want to be transported anymore with public transport, where the users actually can use our bikes because they're out there all night long. So the public transport can maybe be shut off an hour early or something like that. So we're actually helping the city to become a more livable city, to allow people to be transported 24/7. And so we're looking forward to find a good way to share our data, but also to be supported from the city of Zurich.
Thank you, Lucas. And over to you, Sam, on the role of cities and data.
Yeah, I think it's critical. I think that the role that cities can play, other than all the various data points that they take in, like parking information or vehicle counts or traditional level of service calculations, that they have an opportunity, and I think probably an obligation, at least that's my opinion, to be the referee of the mobility sphere. Is that they don't need to disincentivize anything, but just to lay out the ground rules and then to help us aggregate data. That's one of my favorite things about working in transportation and in mobility, is the sheer amount of data that's out there. And on our end at Capital Metro, I think that we take a very data-driven approach to our business to make sure that we're running service the right way in the right places. We are upgrading our fare system so that we can get in line with many of our peers. I'm sure most of the agencies in Switzerland and in Europe, but so that we can have an account-based smart card type system so that we can do a much better job of tracking origins and destinations. Right now, we know how many people use the service, but we don't know where they're going. We can extrapolate where they're going, but that's another huge part of having the city collecting data, at least from a transit professional standpoint, on micromobility providers, is that it allows us to understand where are we getting the most first and last mile, the most connectivity to our service, and then what areas is micromobility the best solution? And honestly, it may be such a good solution that it would make sense to redeploy transit elsewhere. So maybe you have a central downtown hub, but you don't need to have a bus route every other block running through the central business district, because those trips are going to be made on foot, they're going to be made on a scooter, on a bike, on an e-bike. So there's a lot of value there to allow us to run our business a lot more efficiently. And I would hope as we go forward that transit agencies can get a lot more partnerships going that are mutually beneficial with microtransit providers. You know, if I was in Zurich, maybe it would be with Bond, and that way we could share the information and that we could help one another. Because again, I think if you looked at a Venn diagram, the amount of true competition, at least between transit with the distance of trips that we run and micromobility, it's just not there. They don't sabotage one another. They just do two very different but complementary things that still should reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled in a car. And that's the name of the game. I think at the end of the day, most of the people on this webinar and Lucas and Giles and Villanova, that's really the business that we're in, is how can we move people more efficiently, smarter. And one of the biggest ways to do that is to not just let single occupancy vehicles wander around, have subsidized parking. I think, Lucas, your example of the amount of space that you take up relative to a parking space and what you pay for your smaller space is really fascinating. So there's a lot of ways that we can do this better. And I think there's a lot of benefit for transit, but also for people who are in the private sector.
Thank you very much, Sam. So I'm getting a bit of echo. We're slightly over, but I just wanted to finish off with one question again to both of you. So from Sam looking at Europe and Lucas looking back at, say, US, North America, what would you like to share or learn from the other continent in terms of micromobility and new mobility? Or what are you kind of seeking that you're seeing that's interesting on the other side of the ocean that you might like to apply to your own market or learn more about? Perhaps, Lucas, if you want to go first.
So actually, we were trying to start business in North America. Unfortunately, the market regulations and insurance has been really, really high. So we decided to not start this experiment at the moment. So actually, I think what I would love to learn from the markets in the States is how do those governments establish a good connection to micromobility providers, that we have a security that when we plan to come to a city, that we know that in half a year time the same regulations are in place than 6 months before. And if you have a good standard way, I'm really happy to learn more about that, because that was not the case last year, and we will be. I personally would be really happy to come to Austin and revisit again, because I've been there and I really like the city, and I thought it would be really cool to bike with a Bond bike through Austin.
Yes.
Thank you, Lucas. And over to Sam. What would you like to learn from Europe?
Well, one, I would welcome Lucas to come and to bring the Bond bike, and then I will go to Zurich. I'm more than happy to, especially during the summer. I think that going back, I think that's something that the U.S. can learn a lot more about, is how does government build infrastructure that does more for more people and for different kinds of modes. I think it's been difficult for us, being so car-centric for so long, to build infrastructure that better accommodates micromobility and cycling, and building things on a scale that are better for people on foot or on a bike or on transit. Everything from the size of an enormous parking lot to curb cuts, to how lanes are set up, to everything is all built for the person in the car making a very short trip or a long trip. And so how can we get better? The shot that Lucas had, the photo there in Zurich of the bridge, you know, I've seen some examples in the United States which are fantastic, like in Portland with Pillicum Crossing, where you have these large dedicated bikeways as well as transit-only spaces. So how can we do a better job, at least from my experience, having been to Europe and spoken to European counterparts, how can we do a better job as government agencies of building infrastructure that accommodates a lot of different types of mobility? I feel like Europe has been in the multimodal business for far longer than the United States, especially Texas. So I think we have a lot to learn there of how can government build better spaces to accommodate this.
Thanks, Sam. And again, we'll go straight into any final words. Sam, do you want to go first? And if we keep it relatively short, then we'll go to Lucas. Sure. And then we'll wrap up.
Well, I just wanted to thank Villanova and Giles and Lucas and everybody who's here and everybody who's offered up a question. Again, my contact information was down below if you ever want to get in touch with me, sam.sargent@capmetro.org. But I just wanted to say thank you for this chance to talk about micromobility and to incorporate the transit component of this, because I think that we've seen an enormous amount of change, we've seen an enormous amount of hurt during the crisis, but I think that we're going to have a huge amount of opportunity. I think in a lot of ways, my hope is that it causes us all, and maybe it's because we're just at home and have nothing else to do, it causes us all to rethink how we live and how we move and realize how many options are out there, realize how many opportunities for partnership are out there, and that maybe some good can come out of this as we reemerge into cities and into our communities, that we can move differently and build our transportation infrastructure much differently. So thank you again to Villanova. It's been a real pleasure. I'll hand it over to Lucas.
Thank you, Sam. Over to Lucas, your final thoughts.
So I believe this crisis is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Let's use it wisely, because we won't face so fast again such a situation. And we already seen what we're able to change if we really want to. Let's take on this health crisis first, and then let's focus on the climate crisis. And I think transportation can really be at the center of both crises. So thank you very much, Villanova, for inviting me, and thank you for Sam and Gilles, and if all the good questions. We did not have time to answer all the questions, but reach out to me. It's lucas@bond.info. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, we have a webinar survey. Please, it's available for panelists on the webinar you're looking at and on the invite as well. Please do have a look at that and fill that out. But I'd like to thank Lucas Buehler from Bond Mobility and Sam Sargent from Capital Metro in Austin, Texas, for joining us today and sharing some of their thoughts on the mobility challenges we're facing. This is the last webinar, unfortunately, in the series we've been running. That said, Villanova is still very active in this area, and with cities and operators around Europe and more broadly around the world, we're very, very keen to thought lead, help embed and bring better data and better insight into micromobility and link that into the wider public transport and the whole space within cities all over the world. Again, thank our guests for their time. Thank you for joining us today. Keep safe and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.